I also set up the final part of your research project this morning. So let me show you what that looks like. So the research project had 3 parts, if you remember. One was the paper itself, one is the presentation, and then one is adding comments to other people's presentations. So this is at the very end. This is the very last module in the Canvas portal. And it says research presentation discussions. And it's at the top, it says read this first. So this is what you're going to read first. Assuming the cloud server is alive again. Oh, please be alive, cloud server. Oh, freaking cloud server, I think, is back down. Oh, I wish I would have just kept one of the pages stashed. It basically says, and you can read it once the Amazon cloud servers come back online. It says you are going to be graded on making comments on 3 people's presentations, and you pick the 3 immediately after you. So let's say I am Liz. I'm Liz, then I go down to here. It says, this is me. I am doing this one. So I have to go make comments on Irene. Oh, here it is. Okay, peer commentary. So look over and add to the discussion on at least 3 of the presentations created. You must comment on the 3 immediately following years. So I was like saying, let's say we had these people: Alex Alligator, Benny Bunny, Corinne Coyote, Debbie Deer, Eddie Elephant, and Francisco Fox. You know, Alex would do Benny Bunny, Corinne, and Debbie. Benny would do the ones after Corinne, Debbie, and Eddie. If you were Eddie, because you're at near the bottom, you wrap around. Eddie's going to do Francisco and then back Alex and Benny. If I was Francisco, I'd wrap around and do Alex, Benny, and Corinne. So basically, you need to do the 3 immediately following you. That's so we're going to make sure that there is an equal distribution. And then if you want to respond to anybody else's just because you're interested, feel free. You know, it doesn't have to just be those 3. You can comment on other people's, but you have to do minimally those 3. And also, it says, add something that addresses the covered material. Again, something more than just great job, right? So I want to make sure you're actually, you know, engaging on the level of the material rather than just something fluffy and superficial. Right, so if I kind of go back, you get the idea. You have until, oh, here it is. All right, so let's say, you know, let's say I was Sarah. And so I got to do Jonathan's one. So I click on Jonathan here. And it should open up. It will open up and it will have his entire presentation. I converted them all to PDFs because it just loads way easier. But you'll see the whole presentation there so you can look and review. In reality, we'll have some people will have been presenting. Oh, here they are. You know, it says comments should be thoughtful, relevant, engage the material. It says you will not see your classmates' posts until you post your own work. You know, so I don't want you just like reading what someone else write and write the same thing or whatever. Be respectful. You can challenge each other's ideas, but not each other personally. You know, sometimes it's better to be kind than right. Don't like, you know, Jonathan, how can you talk about this? Like, what about all the people who are starving if we don't like use these things? Like, you're not, don't you have any compassion for the people who aren't going to be dying because we're using these herbicides, like, that would be inappropriate. Right. So here, you can see what it is. It's there. There's going to be, everybody's thing is like this. And then there is the place for your comments. So again, you have the next 2 weeks to do this. It has to be done by midnight on Friday of finals week, because I need to have this to come up with your final grades. Also, if you do it earlier, it's better, because then people actually get to see your comments before the Canvas site shuts down. So it's much more fun if people have a chance to respond to each other. And I would, yeah, so any questions about that? Cool, cool, cool. All right. So let's do some more presentations. I mean, I have to say, I've been looking through some of these, and yeah, they're cool. People picked really interesting topics. And I'm interested to hear what people have to say, and I think you'll all be interested to hear what each other has to say as well. Remember that, err on the side of kind of going through stuff relatively quickly, because we do want to cover as many as we can. But that being said, say what you need to say as well. So we're going to go to, oh my God, the Google random number generator. Generate. Oh, so generate, it's the second person on here is Earhart, Nicole E. So that'd be Nicole and Bonnie. If you would be so kind as to present what you have been studying here. So I'm going to stop sharing to allow you to grab a hold of control here. And please give your attention to Nicole and Bonnie.
All right, Bonnie, you're kicking us off.
Sorry, my laptop is a little laggy because my battery is really low. And
But
There
Bonnie, why don't you put an adapter in it so it doesn't stop in the middle of your presentation?
she's the one sharing. I'm not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it should be fine. Okay. So we did music and its contributions to memory and neuroplasticity. Nicole, can you go to that? Thank you. All right. For our research topic, we chose to explore how music aids in the retrieval of memories. Recent studies have been done in the last decade that focus on using music therapy in the lives of people who suffer with neurodegenerative disorders, and that affect their memory and the plasticity of their brains. We narrowed our focus specifically to look at how it affects people with multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, other forms of dementia, as well as strokes.
So first we looked at the physiology of memory and neuroplasticity. And memory basically is just data and information that's encoded, stored, and retrieved in our brain. And we have long-term and short-term memory. And your short-term memory is the ability to hold and recall information over a short period of time, which is usually like seconds to minutes, because then it's converted into a long-term memory if it's going to stick around. And then long-term memory integrates, obviously, like I just said, the short-term memories and stores it for long period of times, including like your life. It could be your entire life span. And long-term memory and short-term memory are both processed in the hippocampus, but long-term memory is stored in the cortex, while short-term memory is mostly stored or primarily stored in the frontal lobe of your cerebral cortex. Now, the hippocampus and the cortex work together in order to interpret their stimuli, to retrieve either old memories and help us navigate. It also helps us store them so we can learn more. And it's the neurons that fire as a response to the stimuli. So the memory, the information, and the data that's being processed. And so basically, if it's like your mom's face, that's something you know really well, right? Like it's just since you were born. So it's going to actually take fewer neurons to fire off than, say, someone you just met. That would take a lot more neurons. Strengthening your link between the neurons will help us recognize people and places we haven't seen or met through repeated exposure. So basically, like the more you see it, the better the memory is going to become, and it'll start gradually working down to fewer neurons the longer you have the repeated exposure.
So we kind of focus on the visual part, but it's also these studies have been showing that like music and sound are also aid in the retrieval of memories. And so I read Musicophilia by Oliver Sacks, which is a book where he explores a lot of different cases of people who, where music therapy has, he just studied how music therapy affected them. So in particular, he talked about an amnesia patient who suffered from the loss of his implicit memory, but he maintained his procedural memory. And what was interesting is his wife played music for him, and he didn't even recognize his wife most days. Yet the music, what he was able to play the music, lead a choir, he was able to write music. So it's kind of cool how that worked. And so we talked about short-term memory, which is temporary storage of information, and working memory, which is actually the storage of information as well as the manipulation of the stored memory to perform cognitive functions. And the next one, and I added the brain from Pinky and the Brain. For the stroke study, this study in particular was done to see if music-based therapy could recover from memory loss, or could recover memory loss and other cognitive functions. So they use an fMRI, which we talked about in class, to gather results based off of 12 subjects. And they listened to 5 different songs varying in genre. And the results were significant because they showed an increased blood flow during the playing of familiar and emotionally resonant music for stroke victims. Why this is beneficial is they can eventually, hopefully, regain the lost neuroplasticity through the continuous stimulating of the targeted regions. So they not only looked at specific regions of the brain that were targeted during these different genres that were being played, but they also, and they did that through looking at blood flow, which you can see in this picture at the top. Self is like way higher than they had some more unfamiliar music. And then finally they had like a spoken word piece, which had a way at the bottom, like virtually no connections.
Okay, so we looked at specifically, like she said at the beginning, multiple sclerosis. And with multiple sclerosis, it's a demyelinating disease of your central nervous system. And we spoke about it a little bit in class, but it disrupts the flow of information within the brain and between the brain and the body. And so MS affects both of your sensory motor and cognitive systems. And your symptoms are going to include like reduced speed in processing of information, lower fluency in phonological and somatic speech, verbal and visual episodic memory deficits, and dysfunction in both attention and executive tasks, I think is what it's supposed to say. The study I looked at was at the influence of neurological music therapy on mood, motivation, emotional status, and cognitive functions in patients with MS. They had a control group and an experimental group, and the control group solely did conventional cognitive rehabilitation, but the experimental group did the CCR plus neurological music therapy. Now, while both groups obviously benefited from the CCR, the experimental group had better results in cognitive function. And also the experimental group showed improvement not only in emotional status, but motivation, mood, and their overall quality of life. And so their conclusion of the study was that it would be the NMT, the music therapy, would be a complementary approach to enhance the conventional cognitive rehabilitation.
So then we looked at music therapy implementation with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. So one of the benefits being that it's a non-medicinal approach. They use, though Alzheimer's is an incurable disease, they use a lot of heavy drugs to prolong the disease, but a lot have very sedative effects. There's a lot of loss of, even more loss of cognition and mobility. Next one. Thank you. So we focused on this clinical study where they took 42 patients with varying levels of dementia and provided 6 weeks of music therapy. And they studied each subject's score prior through these series of examinations done by medical professionals, which they then did after the musical therapy as well to compare results. They also checked to see if any results were influenced by the degree of dementia severity. So that was one of the focuses. So the music was selected based on each subject's preference, which was a questionnaire beforehand. And some other things that are affected by like music incoming is the endocrine and autonomic nervous systems through the lowering of stress-related activation. And then the results of this study showed marked improvements in cognitive function, mood improvement, language, and reduced behavior problems following stressful encounters, which you can see in the image to the left. The top is the mild dementia results, and then the bottom would be the moderate. And the one, sorry, I'm trying to point, the one on the left was the baseline numbers. So you can see they all lowered. And then I looked at another study. It was a mixed method study, which took qualitative and quantitative methods in a single study. And the limitation though, for this one, which was important in the end, is that there was no control group. So they basically just took all of the data, but they didn't have anything to compare it to, which does impact that. So they studied it on, this is one of the largest to date studies on 4,000 residents in nursing homes in California. And it was a total of 3 years. The results showed that music and memory therapy showed reductions in reliance on psychotropic medication by 11% and anxiety medications by 17% lowered, antidepressants by 9%, aggressive behaviors by 20%, depressive symptoms, reported pain and falls all lowered as well as an improved mood.
So we did studies that do not support our initial findings, and I looked at thought, and it looked at the effectiveness of music mnemonics, learning strategies for people with multiple sclerosis. And they used 38 participants, and they were divided into randomly two groups. 20% or 20 people learned through music and 18 learned through speech. They at the beginning established their baseline so they could see if there was progress or not. And this study showed that there was actually no significant difference between the two groups in their neuropsychological functioning or in recognition of tasks. And it suggests that the severity of the disease may be a factor in whether the music therapy benefits them or not.
So yeah, so we thought it was important to include studies as well that like did not work or prove like the theories that we had been studying for this paper. So another study was actually done in Rwanda to see if the use of all the results from the Western studies also kind of cross globally. And they used Rwanda because of the impact of the Rwandan genocide, leaving many Rwandans very traumatized, and because music therapy had been linked to positive emotional responses and cognitive improvement, they had hoped that this study would help. They used specifically Rwandans who remembered and experienced the genocide. Using, again, similar to the first study that I talked about, they had a control group, but they used 4 different types of musical conditions. So they used familiar, pleasant, stimulating music, and they found that it actually had no effect on the working memory of these Rwandans. While the performance in their tasks improved overall, the importance of the music didn't matter. So that emotional connection to the music, they played familiar Rwandan music, didn't have an impact. So the takeaway from that was that cultural differences can limit the effects of music on cognition, but also limit the, just in general, limit the effects of how we do these studies, is looking at them solely through like the gaze of where we are in the world, which I thought was important.
Now, to sum up what we talked about, we provided the background of physiology on how memory works and what the different types of memory are and how they're stored and processed. We also looked at how music is perceived by the brain and explored anecdotal amnesia patient cases, explained fMRI studies that could assist in faster and more complete recovery in stroke patients. We gave you guys background on multiple sclerosis and shared studies done with MS patients, integrated music therapy in addition to their regular treatment. We also looked at Alzheimer's and dementia and the studies that resulted in improved cognitive condition, specifically memory. We also included studies that did not support our findings and need further testing to determine if there's a correlation between music and memory. And just to point out, the counteracting that didn't support my MS study was not like way older of a study. It was really in between a couple of the studies that I looked at. So it wasn't, it seems more valid to me. That's it.
Yep, the end. We have our references too. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions for Nicole and Bonnie?
You guys should all watch Alive Inside if you can. It's a really cool documentary that they did based off of this too.
I wish I had a more specific question, but I will say that I've played jazz for people in nursing homes, and it is like really a treat to watch people chill out, bliss out, and just really relax when you do that. People in their 80s and up. And I will also say, side note, that I've never been flirted with as hard as some of the old ladies in the nursing home that have like nothing to lose and just come up and start talking to you when you're playing jazz to them. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
They're too lost in the music, John.
Could be.
So, and the things about having conflicting results from different studies, that happens a lot. That's part of what hopefully it's a point I've been trying to make actually through the semester, and that you'll walk away with, is that, you can look at the same thing and come up with a different result. And sometimes it's hard to know where that difference arises from. It could be that your particular sample, is just not as random as you'd hoped. Or it could be that the experiment was designed in a slightly different way that leads to different results, but you don't even realize quite what's so different about it. But that's just part of this process. And whenever you are studying the literature, it's important to look at the whole body of work about a certain topic and try to decide where is the center of gravity in this, and also, again, look at how they did it and what they did it, and see, do I actually trust these people's procedures, and again, who funded this, who published it, that as well, because so I'm curious, like the one thing when you were saying with the Alzheimer's patients and talked about music therapy, what does that mean exactly? What is music therapy in that
So
context?
Music therapy is it can be their group or social. From the documentary that I watched, they actually gave each individual subject like their own iPod filled with music that they gathered from the time when the subject grew up. So they looked regionally in the documentary at like where they grew up, what music would have been popular then, and through that they were able to play it for them. And they had like people who were completely comatose patients like were able to recall memories of when they were like walking down the street in Chicago in like 1949 and stuff like that. So they were able to see like what parts of the brain were like in memory were like, yeah.
So I mean, I'm sure people have probably been following the news with Tony Bennett and Lady Gaga.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of amazing. He can play old standards and like really do amazingly beyond. And yeah, he has really kind of tragic dementia in terms of just knowing where he is and who's around him. But yeah, it seems that it's encoded a little differently.
Yeah, and musicophilia, he looks at a lot of people and patients with that. It's really cool.
Right. Oliver Sacks has written books about many different things. His last one before he died is called Hallucinations. It's about it's also awesome book. Musicophilia, like I said, the first one was music. The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. He's got almost anything he's written is worth some hours of your life. All right, thanks. So we're gonna go back to the Google random number generator and click the button round and round. No, it says round. Where the computer algorithm stops, nobody knows. All right, 1, 2, 4. All right, so it lands on Sarah, but we're gonna go to next because Sarah gone. So the next one down is Jonathan. Jonathan Monahan.
All right.
So kind.
So let me share.
Gonna talk about Roundup.
Roundup. So I think the best way for me to do this is I made it too long. So I'm gonna rush over the parts that you guys probably are familiar with. If you've ever gone into like Berkeley Bowl to buy whatever you're gonna buy and there's somebody really earnest standing out in front with a clipboard and they want to talk to you about glyphosate. I'm going to kind of rush through those parts. So just briefly, it is an herbicide. It's the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup. And since Roundup lost its patent maybe 20 years ago, it's now in a bunch of all sorts of herbicides. We call them GBHs, glyphosate-based herbicides. So just some starter facts. We use it all over the place. We, the U.S., this is from 2018, 280 million pounds applied just in that year, but it goes up and up every year.
Jonathan, you can go into a presentation mode. That way we don't see all this other stuff there.
Okay. Better?
Yeah, it's a lot better.
All right. Let me reduce you guys all so I can. All right. So this next quote is a little interesting. This is from a 2016 study, so it's a little bit dated, but Roundup came out in 1974. This study was done in 2016, and of all the billions of pounds applied between those two dates, about 3/4 of it worldwide was just in the last 10 years leading up to that. So you get the idea. Use has skyrocketed since the late 90s. And it sticks around. It's in the soil, it's in the groundwater, it's in all the things that eat the crops, some living, some dead, the crops, that is, and the weeds. And a lot of the food that a lot of animals that end up in our food chain are fed feed that includes glyphosate resistant crops. And of course it sticks around a little bit in us as well because of that. So what I set out to learn is really, what is it? how's it work, how to get to be everywhere in the globe. What effects does it have on humans, on the environment? And most importantly, and kind of most curious to me, why are we still talking about it? Like 50 years later, why is it up in the air whether it's destructive or not? That seems like we could have figured that out by now. All right. I'm not exactly sure how to, my computer screen looks a little different right now. Hold on one sec.
If you just hit an arrow key, the one to the going right, it should.
You would think so. Whoa. Oh, it's never done this before. This is going to be fun. Okay, so here is glyphosate itself, the chemical signal. Sorry, the chemical structure of it. And it's basically a glycine amino acid right there with a little phosphate group and a little methyl. So the, oh, this is great. I wish that would stay up, but okay. This is the actual chemical name for it. I've never actually done this in animation mode, so this is throwing me off. All right, so here's what it does. It blocks this enzyme in plants. It's a critical piece of plant metabolism that we humans don't have. And that's why it's kind of this magic bullet, and that's why I put the good up here. These are the things that people got really excited about in the late 60s and 70s when they discovered what an effective herbicide it is. It enters plants through a variety of different ways and moves throughout them really easily and kills everything in the plants that it works with. All right, I'm pressing buttons here. There we go. So the other thing that's great about it, or was thought to be great, was that it goes away pretty quickly. It's like this little plant assassin that jumps out of nowhere and has a half-life of sometimes hours. In the first study they did, suggested that half-life was more like 1 day. All right, sorry for these pauses. I'm getting used to this. So for that reason, people called it a once-in-a-century herbicide. Now, that's what was thought to be good about it. Then we have all this stuff that is not so good. It's a chelating agent, and it sequesters micronutrients that plants need, that humans need, and that bacteria and fungi need. So that's no good. Also, this pathway that it disrupts is not only found in the plant kingdom, but also it's used by bacteria and fungi. So that's obviously going to spell trouble for us, for our gut flora, for the soil health, for a bunch of things. And then it turns out that glyphosate does not break down as quickly as we originally thought. In fact, it can take years depending on the content of the soil. And when it does break down, it breaks down into AMPA, which is not to be confused with like AMPA receptors that we studied a little bit in the nervous system. It's another compound, and formaldehyde. And AMPA is probably toxic. Formaldehyde is definitely toxic. So that's not so good either. And if this is a good, this is a bad. The ugly is the adjuvants. And adjuvants are things that are added to something like Roundup in addition to glyphosate, to the active ingredient. So these might be surfactants, they might be anti-foaming agents, other things that are put in to help glyphosate do its job. There's 750-ish different formulations of glyphosate-based herbicides out there. So a formulation is like a specific chemical cocktail that then goes into the brand name Roundup. The problem with all this is that a lot of these adjuvants are nasty. They're toxic. They're worse than glyphosate. So some formulations are found to be 1,000 times more toxic than glyphosate by itself. And the main problem is that agrochemical companies are not required to test for adjuvants. They don't need to disclose if they're toxic or not because they're legally considered inert. So this is something that I didn't know, and this is a big issue. If you're only testing for glyphosate, it makes more sense instead to test for the toxicity of the whole product that's actually being used. It never really acts alone. Okay, this I'm going to kind of rush through. If I had done this right, I'd have another graph that shows how much glyphosate is being used in the world. It kind of goes along. Monsanto makes Roundup. Great, some more is sold, but it just kind of kills everything. So it's not used much. And then they finally, in the late 90s, introduced Roundup Ready crops. And then it would go like, wait, use would just explode. And that's how we got to the current situation, is through these Roundup Ready crops. The other thing that happened during this time that led to even more use is that there's a bunch of weeds that sprang up that are resistant to glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides. So all these health problems really started making themselves known right about here. Briefly, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, released this report in 2015 with this kind of like casual sounding phrase, probably carcinogenic, and that opened up a whole bunch of legal issues that we hopefully will have time to talk about later. Okay.
You should probably, in case people aren't familiar with what a Roundup Ready crop is, explain why it's so attractive to the agricultural business.
Sure. So as we've been saying, glyphosate itself is going to kill pretty much all plants, and then they develop the species, different kinds of crops. Like say you have a corn or a maize crop, they introduced into the crop itself this kind of workaround, chemical or biochemical workaround, so that it actually could work without that enzyme that glyphosate disrupts. So that even when you spray it on the crop itself, the crop does fine and all the weeds around it die. So you can just go to town with Roundup and not worry about diminishing your crop. And even better, from the agricultural company's point of view, you can actually spray it, a bunch of it, right before harvest, and it's called a desiccant. It just like dries it out and gets it ready more quickly for harvest. So you shorten the growing season. So all that leads to a lot more use of glyphosate. Okay, about what it does to us. It's able to enter through our mouth when we eat it, or eat crops, that have been doused with it, as we were just talking about. And we drink it if we're in an agricultural community and it's accumulated in the water table. And then it can get into our skin thanks to those same adjuvants that we were talking about that help it penetrate into plant tissue. So if you are a worker in like a heavy agricultural situation, it's quite easy for glyphosate to get into your skin. There's been many studies, like hundreds of studies, linking it to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a cancer of your lymphocytes. And yet none of them are really smoking guns. There's one or two that have come out in the last year that look to be about as close as you would normally need for that kind of thing. But we'll go into a little bit later why it's been hard to find these smoking gun type studies, but plenty of links. Okay, it is also toxic to the liver and the kidneys. This is a study that demonstrated that, and it also is an endocrine disruptor, having effects on androgens and estrogens. And this is in humans, and then there's all these like, what would you call them? Anecdotal evidence of birth defects in the communities around heavy agriculture. And so this study that looked at birth defects on piglets, a lot of people started using that to kind of try and look at different ways to see in what ways that glyphosate might be causing birth defects in animals, including humans. And this next one, I'm going to go into more detail on the next slide, but it's got a picture of these poor little rats with these awful tumors. So if anybody doesn't want to see that, fair warning, and I'll tell you when we're moving on to the next slide. But the study in general looked at organ damage in rats that were fed a diet with Roundup feed, with Roundup Ready feed. And so you actually have two studies. And the first one that we're looking at on the left was a Monsanto study where they wanted to bring this corn to market that was a new version of a Roundup Ready crop. And they set up this study where they said, okay, let's take 3 groups of rats. The first one, we're going to have just regular non-GMO corn. Second group, we're going to give them 11% Roundup Ready corn. And the third group will have even more Roundup Ready corn in their diet. And then after 90 days, let's look at all 3 of them. And when they tested it, they said, okay, good. They look basically the same. This is awesome. Let's bring it to the market. And so in 2004, they did. 10 years later, these European scientists repeated the experiment, but said, wait a second, 90 days is not long enough for these results to really, for all the harm that could come from this to make itself known. So let's do the exact same experiment, but check in on these rats after 2 years. And when they did, they found a lot of liver congestion and necrosis. They found kidney problems. I believe the exact phrase was degenerative kidneys with turgid inflammatory areas. It's memorable. And then they had these mammary disturbances, is a quote, and those are the fibro adenomas and things that you see here. So the conclusions there are not only that, hey, it might really be harmful to animals, but also that most of the studies that we've done so far are not looking long enough term. And that's been something that I guess endocrinologists have been trying to get people to change for years. Okay, I am going to gloss over this because I know I'm running long, the short version. I'm happy to go into detail as needed, but 3 ways that it's pretty dang bad on the environment is that it really makes the soil less healthy, which hurts everything trying to grow in it. It accumulates in fresh water and can, even at low levels, it can really disrupt food chains and ecosystems. And then this right here could be like an hour-long presentation on how much it's disrupted agriculture worldwide. I'm sorry to rush that, but I want to give other people a chance. I'm happy to come back to it if anybody wants more information on that. The main thing I got out of this was like trying to understand the ways that it's tested more. Try to understand the testing and how people could come to such different conclusions. So I looked at 2 different studies that in themselves are reviews of, in this case, how carcinogenic glyphosate is. So each one of these is a study of studies, and I did a study of a study of studies. So on the left, you have an EPA review from 2016. And I'm just going to cut to the chase and say that they concluded, oh, it's not likely to be carcinogenic. But in doing that, they looked at a lot of studies, but most of them were industry commissioned. They were unpublished, and they focused on the active ingredient alone. And when looking at what people we might be talking about, they were talking maybe about me, somebody that does not work in agriculture, and I think about things when I buy my vegetables and I wash them assiduously. They were just talking about kind of the best case scenario. And then that World Health Organization report that decided that or concluded that it was probably carcinogenic. They looked at a lot of the same studies, but they included more, and they focused mostly on peer-reviewed studies. And they focused on the active ingredient formulations, and the metabolites of glyphosate. And they looked at people that work in farms and groundskeepers. And so that is why their conclusions were so different. Let me back out of this one. And this is kind of what I took away from it, that glyphosate, despite me talking about how bad it is, I actually went into it thinking maybe it was more like MSG, like people are making a big deal out of it, but by itself, it's not that bad. And there is some truth to that. It's more the fact that we use too much of it, way too much, and that we don't have a good idea about how much harm it can do, because the regulatory testing just creates this big black box that we can't really see into. For example, a lot of the regulatory testing that's still done on it uses data from tests that are 40 years old, and that data comes from industry, it comes from Monsanto itself. And that data, it's considered proprietary. It's not easily made available for anybody to check it out and draw their own conclusions, unless they work for Monsanto or now Bayer or the EPA. Also, these same companies are not required to test for adjuvant toxicity or even say what adjuvants are in there, because that would be like an industry trade secret, and they're not legally required to say that. So what I would like to see, and what I think we should have in the case of glyphosate and anything like this, is more thorough, longer term testing, and just more transparency in terms of what adjuvants are in there. Testing of it should be mandatory, and it should be the responsibility of the big companies. And I just want to say one more thing. There's kind of something approaching a happy ending. So this is kind of a zoom in on that timeline. All those lawsuits started piling up. Monsanto said, well, they just looked vulnerable. So in comes Bayer, this big even bigger agrochemical company, and buys them. And weeks later, the first lawsuit is decided, and it's awarded to this guy that actually worked not too far from here, this groundskeeper from the school system, who was awarded $280 million, which is awesome. Chalk went up for the little guys. And then this couple from California got $2 billion, and a bunch of other lawsuits started being decided at that time. So Bayer said, okay, we will settle for $10 million, and that'll take care of $10 billion, that'll take care of these thousands of lawsuits that are coming in. And then just this last summer, they were also trying to protect themselves from future litigation, and that was rejected. So at that point, they said, okay, no more glyphosate in U.S. home and garden materials, which is pretty cool, but it's also just a small step forward, right? It's still going to be used in farms everywhere, and it is that's just American. Home and gardens the world over can still have their glyphosate in it, but it's a good reminder that that we can make big, powerful companies do the right thing, even if for the wrong reasons. Thank you.
Alrighty.
Are you guys still there? I can't see any of you.
All right, so you can.
Yeah.
Oh, there we are. Awesome.
All right, does anyone have any questions for John?
I'm wondering how we compare to like Europe, for instance, in the use of Roundup and glyphosate. I know they're stricter with things like that, so I'm just wondering if you know anything about that.
That's a good question. Europe is generally more okay. So they are stricter. I think they like the safe use levels are about a third of what we have in the U.S. They still use it a lot there, and part of the problem is that giant agrochemical company that I talked about, Bayer. We all know it from aspirin and stuff. That's a German company. So Angela Merkel, who is, on the way out as a prime minister, she and other European leaders have been kind of supporters of glyphosate, and they are on the side, not the side, I don't want to say that, but people are saying, well, the jury's still out. And I think most European scientists many European scientists that aren't employed by industry are saying the jury is not out. There's just enough noise that you guys are making that we're creating the illusion of the jury still being out to keep this thing going as long as we can. But it is used there just at levels that are lower than the US.
You should check out Rachel Carson too if you haven't read any of her stuff, because she was the original, like she studied DDT and stuff like back when they were spraying kids down the street with DDT before they like do all the harm. Rachel Carson was a really, really cool woman.
Yeah, I've never read Silent Spring, but I've heard a lot about her. And that was kind of what I was saying with compared to DDT and compared to malathion, glyphosate by itself is like a lot better and a lot safer. It's just that we use so much more of it than we ever used of any of the things that she wrote about.
Right. And there's also the collateral damage in terms of the ecosystems that are really hard to gauge and that people aren't, I think, don't think about as much as they should. So
Yeah, what I was,
focused on their particular problem of maximizing monoculture crop yield and aren't really thinking about the other things that are happening besides that. But we do need to actually move on, because I want to make sure at least maybe a couple of other people get to talk here. So, but that's another thing that shows how just because you have your objective, getting a definitive answer is tricky. And a lot of times there is no definitive answer and you have to, so it's, the scientific method is very useful. And every once in a while it can give you really clear answers. Like DDT was totally messing with bird shells and things like that. Or other things, but sometimes you get the data. That's part of why the project we didn't do, which is where you design your own experiment and get the data and try to come to conclusions. That one's also kind of fun and frustrating, because you see how tricky it is. Even if you've got your question and you've got your methods and let's go get the answer, it's like, it's hard to tell you what the definitive answer really is. So just kind of putting that out there. That's why you look at lots of, and the more you know about science, the more you can be sophisticated in how you accept or don't accept others' conclusions when you read papers and studies like this. All right, so let us go back to the Google random number generator, which is right here. And hit the button. It takes us to, it says Irene Kunga. Irene, would you like to present? Yeah, I've got to stop here. So I think we're going to learn about turmeric.
I'm new to this, so
Yeah, remember you're not getting graded on your like sophisticated presentation. So you're just getting, this is about sharing what you found. So turmeric, I have to say personally, it seems like a miracle spice.
hold on. Technical issues.
Yeah, no, my parents bought like Costco, you get big packs of this stuff. It's like, here, you should take this. We like it. It's working for us. I'm like, oh, whatever. And it's like, I start taking it. It's like, holy crap, my knees feel so much better. It's so weird.
So my presentation was on turmeric and which this word took me a while. It's curcumin to find
Okay.
out how to pronounce it. I got interested in turmeric and curcumin as a runner. I've been running all my life. You get runner's knee and inflammation, which is why I decided to start using more turmeric just to avoid the inevitable knee issues. And so I started using turmeric and I did notice a difference. It's not that vast, but you get a little bit less inflammation. So I decided to look into turmeric. This is the structure and chemical formula of turmeric. It is a lipo.
We don't.
Okay, so we'll go to next screen. Okay, so it's a lipophilic polyphenol. It is attracted to fats and is not non-polar. The polyphenol means that it is naturally antioxidant. Next screen, please. So the main active molecule that gives it that bright yellow color is the curcumin. This is the main active ingredient of cumin. It gives it the bright color and its actual sort of peppery taste. It's non-polar, dissolves fats and lipids. But the fact that it does not dissolve in water affects how much bioavailability it gives to your body. In other words, if you take it, it does get out of your system much faster than how much the body can make use of it. 75% of it is excreted out very quickly if there's no other way for the body to hold onto it. It is a natural antioxidant. When it metabolizes, it depends on how the breakdown happens. The breakdown can happen either in minutes, in hours, and can go as long as days. The type of breakdown that happens depends on enzymes used or if enzymes are not used. But each of the breakdown processes gives different products that act differently to the bodies. It can be metabolized into 8 related groups of free radicals that can act into your body, depending on how the breakdown happened. The main protein that curcumin affects is nuclear factor KB protein complex. This is the main protein complex that controls all inflammation in your body, the different pathways that it acts into your body. And so these are all the these are all the pathways that are started off by breakdowns of curcumin. So all these factors like IL-8, TNF alpha, these are all pathways that will go into transcription of DNA, how it acts into your innate defense systems. And the main one, as we see, it's at the end there, up the NFKB, is actually very, it's the main one that affects everything else. So curcumin can affect all of them. And this slide just shows liver diseases are affected by some of the pathways. Lung diseases are affected, neurodegenerative diseases. So there could be effects on Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, it can help in that. Infectious diseases can be helped. These are all tied up to the pathways and that curcumin can affect. Next slide. So NFKB, the nuclear factor, is the main pathway that is tied to all of these different gene inductions. And so it will affect your chemokines, which affect angiogenesis, your cytokines, which are start off inflammation, proliferation of cancer cells, cell survival of cancer cells, apoptotic, how your cells die. Also how your dendritic cells mature, your memory T cells, how they differentiate, how they get activated. Macrophages, which are pro-inflammatory, but can also be harmful in the end, and neutrophils as well. NFKB is tied to all those pathways. And next slide. And the other main pathway that is really effective with NFKB is P93. NFK nuclear factor controls P93, which is a tumor suppressor. When people have cancer, P93 is suppressed. P93 helps to kill cells. And so NFKB can help P93 be overregulated, which helps to kill cancer cells. And so it does help when used alongside with other cancer treatments. Oh, next slide. And so the other way they were trying to look at how, this is very new, how COVID could have, curcumin could be used to help COVID, which is just came up. Curcumin has the ability to change the lipid bilayer on the cells. And so it can dock into the receptor where the SARS COVID virus was going to get into the cell. It's very new. They haven't tested it in humans because COVID it's very recent. They only did this in rats. And they found that it does block the receptors. Human trials are still going to be conducted, but it is a way to help other than the vaccine, because not everybody has the vaccine at the moment. It's not a surefire way, but it does block the receptor. And the next slide, please. And this was the other way I was looking at how it works with, they looked at how it blocks neuroblastoma in children. It's a cancer that mostly children between when they're infants to two-year-olds is when they discover it. And they realize that if they use it with anti-cancer drugs, it does help in mitochondrial dysfunction, to stop mitochondrial dysfunction. And so the cancer cells are able to die faster. So it helps in giving the children less radiation alongside with curcumin. This was also still very, very new, all in testing as well. Next slide. Another issue that is being, this has been tested in humans. It's one of the few things where curcumin has been tested, is skin remodeling. With age, we get a lot of sun damage, and that means you have, you do have inflammation little by little. It's not, it's just inflammation that sort of adds up and adds up. It's not critical, you don't feel it, but it does affect your skin. These are from infections, from radiation, from air pollution. So your cytokines are sort of producing inflammatory effects that add up. And so they did an experiment. It was only 28 women. It was a topical cover that they mixed with a few natural ingredients, and they did notice an improvement. They did notice some skin tightening. So this was one of the few things that they can use it for. Turmeric for everyday use is very easy to use. It's highly beneficial because it is cheap. It's cheap, it's easily available, and it's typically biologically safe. Very few people have allergic reactions, if any. And it's easily consumed. You can put it in your food, you can put it in your drinks, you can take it as supplements, but it's something that's very easy and it's very cheap. The main disadvantage is because we absorb so little of it, because it's lipophilic. You sort of need to, if it's your only source, you need to consume a lot of it. It can't be toxic, but you can consume a lot of it. It may also interfere with your blood thinners when it interrupts your ACE receptors on your cells. So they do say that if you do decide to take it, you have to, if you're taking medication like blood thinners, you have to confer with your doctors. But it is available as supplements, and it's cheap, and it is delicious in food. And those are my references. And thank you.
Hold on a sec. All right, let me stop sharing here. Back. Here it is. All right, so thank you. Oh, where's my? There I am. So thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Irene?
That was awesome, Irene. I have a quick question before I go make a turmeric milkshake. The study that looked at the very new study about it looked like it was binding like an antagonist to receptors that would otherwise welcome COVID. Do you know more about like the study itself and kind of how it came to be? Like who who had that crazy idea? Yeah, anything more about the formation of that study and who was it at the study?
They only did it on rats. They've only done it on rats so far. They haven't done it on humans. It was Asian. Turmeric is more used in Eastern Asia, and it's not an American study. It is a study in China, but it was only on rats. They hadn't done it on that was one of the main disadvantages of this, because it's so new. All of the studies on turmeric sort of have fallen in the 2000s. So everything is just sort of coming up now. They haven't got to human trials for a lot of it.
In that COVID study, were there two other, was that ginger and then something else in your picture?
Yes, there was ginger, but for some reason, say cumin is the main one that that goes in and blocks, which is that I couldn't believe how crazy that was, that a spice was able to go in and block the receptor from going in. And no one's used this before, but
turmeric looks like yellow ginger. If you're at the store, it's a picture of turmeric looks like a ginger as well.
yeah, raw turmeric looks like ginger. Before it's dried up, it's not that yellow.
So did you find studies that looked, I mean, because again, my experience of it has been more for just like joint pain and stuff. Like, did you find studies that looked at that?
Yes, I felt like the joint pain, everybody knows it's for joint pain. I found it so interesting that they're trying to look at blocking COVID, a virus, from going in. The inflammation, yeah, it stops the cytokines from the storms from in the inflammation and all that, but the blocking of the virus was it just seemed a lot more interesting. I wish there was more in it, but they just had the one study with the rats. So
All right, well, thank you
The
very
cancer
much.
stuff was pretty incredible too, like the specific ways it interferes with cancer proliferation.
All right,